All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective. And that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure to pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity. But to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy, or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
Well, Jason and Jason, welcome. Really good to see you both and really excited for the conversation today. Let's start with just some quick intros. Both of you are named Jason, so we need to distinguish the voices for the audience here. Jason Watts, why don't you go first with a quick intro?
Yes, thank you for having me on. Jason Watts, I'm the CEO of Scholarship Prep Charter Schools. We've got 4 sites in Southern California.
Awesome. Other Jason?
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having us. I'm Jason Sitomer. I'm Managing Director of Charter Impact. We are a back office financial provider, which do soup to nuts, fractional CFO, accounting, accounts payable, and then we have a full payroll team, as well as we have a data team that can do like SIS and your attendance reporting.
All right. Very cool. Well, appreciate both of y'all being here. And I want to jump right into the topic for today, since all of our conversations are topical. And Jason Watts, let's start with you. The challenge that I wanted to talk about today was hiring, and specifically the role of hiring as you scale an organization, which is something that you all have done the last couple of years and are in the process of continuing to do. So just sort of broad strokes to frame the conversation, why do you think hiring is so hard? And you can answer that question sort of philosophically or kind of practically in the current environment we're sitting in.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, regardless of the time that we are in, it's a guessing game. It's always a guessing game. And you try to do the best you can to narrow down your potential misses in a number of ways. And so I think that's kind of like setting the stage that no matter what, you're always guessing. But now, post-COVID, compared to, say, pre-COVID, I think another huge challenge is finding people that want to work, finding people that want to work in the educational field. So as an example, pre-COVID, in fact, our first year of operation at our first school in Orange County, 2016, we had hundreds of applicants for teacher positions. Now it's, in some cases, single digits. That's a dramatic difference, right? So when your pool is decreased significantly, that means you better hit. And your odds of hitting successfully are completely diminished when maybe you don't have a whole lot of great options to choose from, which we could probably get into later in terms of, well, how do you deal with that? But I think those are 2 kind of like foundational thought processes in terms of like what makes hiring so hard, both generally speaking in the times that we're in now.
And then maybe a follow-up to that would be, how do you think about hiring in the process of scaling up an organization? Maybe are there other factors that come into play when you're trying to go from 1 to 2 to 3, et cetera, in a short time frame? How does that impact sort of the philosophy of hiring or some of the challenges that you face?
Yeah, in no particular order of importance, I think it's really critical to try to hire experts. Don't fixate on hiring people you know, right? A relative, a neighbor, a best friend, whatever. You need to hire experts because at the end of the day, you need them to independently be able to do their job at a high level, whatever that role may be. So I think that has to be a foundational piece. The more experts you have in a school or in an organization allows you to grow more quickly. because now you've got less weak points that you have to address in terms of the mindset around scalability. It also allows you to be more efficient and more effective in every aspect of what you do on a day to day. If you want people to stick around, which is critical for growth, right? They have to like what they do. So if you can marry expertise with them liking or loving what they do, then they're probably going to do a really good job at what you need them to do. And they'll be able to help you in that growth process because you can now rely upon that consistency in that role, right? And then finally, when you're talking about scalability, it's you want people who want to be there on a day-to-day basis and attract others of a similar ilk into your organization. And it might be that some of these people have friends or people they've worked with that they want them to come and join your mission and vision, join your organization. So look, good people tend to rub off on other people. And so the more good people you can bring in, good in terms of attitude, work ethic, personality, on top of all the other components we talked about in terms of expertise, et cetera. I think those are really this kind of, they're simple, but they're really critical to thinking about long-term sustainability from the hiring perspective.
Really good stuff. And I think that's a really good primer for the rest of the conversation, because I want to get into some of the areas where this can go wrong and then some of your learnings and recommendations that others can learn from. But before we get into that, I think some more background would be helpful for your own experience the last few years. So take us back to Scholarship Prep's founding. When was it founded? And maybe if you could give us a brief summary of what the growth has been like and where you guys are at today.
Yeah, so we started in 2016 in Santa Ana in Orange County. And we had about 250 students year one, give or take. And year one was not easy, right? Standalone, small school. We were able to open a second school in an adjacent county, so not even close to our existing site, but in Oceanside, San Diego County, about 45 minutes away. So that created some additional problems just from a logistical standpoint. But now we started to slowly build economies of scale. And now today we've got 4 sites and over 1,600 students. And so we've had every single year incremental growth, whether we grew new schools or we didn't. Part of that is based on some of the things I talked about already in terms of the structure we created organizationally. But it's been a steady growth period for the last 8 years.
Very cool. And is that something that you had a vision for from the start? The first time you and I chatted, one of the things you talked about was there's kind of oversimplifying things, but there's kind of 2 general camps. It's sort of, I'm here to start a single site school in one community in one neighborhood, and I want to see this school be operated for the next 100 years, or the intention to build a model, something that can be replicated, and then use those economies of scale to continue to expand the impact. Did you have a vision from the get-go for Scholarship Prep to be a network of schools, or was that something that sort of happened organically?
Scholarship Prep is my second go-around in building an organization. So having been through it before and seeing the benefit of having multiple sites and, again, economies of scale and all those types of things, I knew the benefits. And more specifically, because of our mission and vision and the populations we wanted to serve, I knew that was even more critical. So our focus being predominantly underserved communities, homeless and foster focused, we knew that in order to provide those services to students and families, we had to be able to be at a scale where we could do that successfully. So there was never a cap or a governor on that from the outset. In my view, it's more about effectiveness and efficiency. So how effective are we in what we're trying to accomplish? If we are able to be effective, do we have the capacity staffing wise to then grow? And sometimes you have to build that capacity once you become effective. But if you try to grow before you're effective, that's problematic to me. So we've tried to build this, I wouldn't say slowly or conservatively, I would say more intelligently. And we were very fortunate to have success early on. And that success has been parlayed into things like large grants that have allowed us to expand as well. But if not for that early success, I'm not sure that we would be as big as we are today.
Sure. That makes sense. And so as you talk about efficiency and being effective, allowing that growth to happen. I want to bring our other Jason into the conversation here. So, at what point did you and the rest of the team, Jason Watts, think about kind of this idea of, do we have the expertise in-house versus do we need to find partners that are experts in a given department field that can help us be efficient and be there as we scale and grow? Like, was that an intentional in-house versus outsourced conversation that was had? And then I'm curious to hear Jason's perspective on kind of where you all met in the growth trajectory. But first question being sort of the decision point about outsourced versus in-house.
We ultimately, and this has been a question that we've addressed probably off and on for the last few years, in terms of, to what extent do we want to bring some of these services in-house versus rely upon vendors or outsourcing? And when you're talking about financial systems and fiscal sustainability and budgeting and those types of things, because of how obviously critical those things are and the required expertise in order to implement them successfully, you have to have an entire team to do these things. And kind of this repeated economies of scale discussion, if you can have a vendor that can bring this large scale staff into the mix, but not cost you similarly if you had to do those things in-house, I think that's really important. And we've had other back office providers before. We were introduced to Charter Impact because one of our cabinet team members had worked with their previous founder, and they had a really strong relationship there. And we were transitioning between back offices, and we were trying to figure out who was the best match for us. And really, in terms of our thought process in that transition, we were getting help kind of on the side from Charter Impact. And through that process, we realized, wait, this should be the vendor. This should be the team we go with. And so it was the right decision, no question. You know, Jason was brought in the mix to kind of oversee our account and has been with us from the beginning. And I think it's critical to have that thought partner who understands your organization, your mission and vision, you know, your desire to grow, and then be able to give you advice. Hey, maybe you should or shouldn't do that right now. And, or this is how you should do those things. So we have a really, I think, upfront rapport in that regard.
So Jason, maybe tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, when you all first met, where were things in terms of the growth trajectory of scholarship prep? And then maybe also share a little bit about, just from the Charter Impact perspective, how you all think about being an outsourced third-party partner to organizations like Scholarship Prep, who are kind of in that growth mode where they're maybe going from 1 to 3 campuses over a couple of years or something like that.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. So, I think your word is perfect there. Charter Impact always wants to think of ourselves as partners, not a vendor. We join every board meeting. We present the financial updates. We have weekly meetings with our clients, or whatever sort of cadence, they want to meet with us. And it's not a you mentality. It's an us mentality, right? I don't speak to the board and say, you guys need to figure out these 3 positions to be added, or, how to spend this grant. It's how can we do this together? And to Jason's point about like in-housing versus having someone outside do it, we have a lot of scalability. If you have an internal team that you have a CFO, if that person leaves, which is what we've seen with like the Great Resignation, a lot of school financial experts have left, you lose all that knowledge, right? Here, Scholarship Prep fractionally has about 16 people assigned. No one person is the key holder. And with that comes a lot of duplicity. So I have 11 directors that report to me that serve as the CFO for our clients. If one leaves, yes, it is painful, but 10% loss. If Jason had just one CFO and that person left, that's 100% loss. And so one is definitely more catastrophic than the other, as well as, let's say Scholarship Prep was doing a lot of purchasing in 1 month. We have over 25 people in accounts payable. If someone takes a vacation, someone else fills in for them. So you get like continuity throughout everything by having that outsource model. Specific to my relationship with Scholarship Prep. So I've been in charter finance, very niche, for 7 years now. I came from a 30 plus school network, and then I've been with Charter Impact for 2.5 years now. And since month one, I've been on the scholarship prep account as their lead thought partner. And it's been a really great relationship. I've seen them grow from 3 sites to 4 with a petition that was approved to open another site and another petition that is going through and petitions out of state. And we continue to be that thought partner to help them grow and expand and reach their vision.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's really helpful breakdown of where you all fit into the picture, and the emphasis that you described on maintaining consistency is something you had mentioned, Jason, about if you're going to scale, you need people who are around, and you need people who are around the whole time with some of that institutional knowledge. So I want to talk more about how the Charter Impact team also supports when it comes to hiring. But before we go into kind of hiring best practices, since that's our topic today, let's talk about some of the ways that this can go wrong, some things that I'm guessing our audience will resonate with. And as you mentioned at the top of the conversation, Jason, sometimes you do your absolute best to get the best people in the door, but without having worked directly with that person before, you never really know until they're in your organization. And so I want to come up with maybe 3 to 5, I'll leave it up to you all to decide, mistakes that leaders or boards make when hiring as they grow and scale. And we can kind of ping pong back and forth between the two of you to build this list. But let's come up with sort of the top ones that come to mind as you all think about what are maybe some of the common mistakes people make. Jason Watts, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I would say that I did mention one of them, being careful not to hire people you know versus people who are better fits for the positions that you're looking for. But I would also say in that process, failing to vet your candidates thoroughly. Taking for granted, oh, we had an interview and it was great, let's just hire that person. Or maybe they've given 3 references and you talk to the first one and it seems like it's a slam dunk and then you're done. You don't want to call the rest of them. I think that's definitely a mistake. The more information you have, the better. And going through that process and being savvy around the information that's being shared with you, right? So when you've done this enough, you can pick up on little subtleties that are shared in your vetting of the candidates when you're talking to their references. And it's sometimes shocking that someone will put a reference down that's not being as supportive or complimentary of them as they probably thought they were going to be. And having that in your mind, like, okay, let me really be careful and think and listen well to what's being said to me. And then maybe that will lead you down another pathway of questions. But it's happened multiple times, probably too many to count, where we've been able to weed out a candidate based on something we heard or received from that vetting process. And that was critical for us going forward.
Yeah, so that's a really good one. So we've got under vetting, and then I'll sort of add as an additional one to that, your emphasis on not just hiring because you have a relationship there, but really hiring for expertise, competence for the role that they're going to be filling. That's a really good one. All right, other Jason, what do you got?
Yeah, so from a charter impact standpoint, so I mentioned I've been here 2.5 years. When I came on, we had 73 employees. We're now over 110 employees. Specific to my team, we actually do 6 rounds of interviews for any director that's hired onto my team. To Jason's point, we really want to vet the people. It is such a niche industry, and people aren't hiring us to come in and learn on the job. We need to make sure we're getting the right people in the right place because they're hiring us as knowledge experts, and that's not their role to go through the growing pains. It's our job to make sure we're hiring the correct people in that role. For my team specifically, once hired on, we have a 90-day training regimen with the realization that we're on a fiscal year, that every report is only going to happen one time during that fiscal year. So it takes 365 days before any new employee that doesn't have finance background in charter schools is going to see that report. And even through a year, you have only seen that report once. You got to pull that memory from a year ago. And so it's really, the learning curve is steep, and we've done a good job to grow and scale and keep that expertise in-house. And knock on wood, I haven't lost a director in over a year. And that's a lot of the continuity we provide to the clients.
All right, we're putting some pressure on your team if they listen to this. None of them are allowed to leave. All right, so we've got hiring without fully vetting or under vetting, and similarly hiring for relationship instead of expertise. And then I'm going to kind of label yours, Jason, sort of hiring without thinking about the learning curve, putting someone into a position where you're basically putting them there and then paying them to learn the job versus being able to immediately make an impact.
And I think on the school side, just to sort of add, if a school is internal, if you have an accountant, it is a leap and jump to become from an accountant to that CFO person, right? And so you really need to train someone up and be thoughtful about that training up as well.
All right, let's do one or two more potential pitfalls. Jason Watts, do you have another one that comes to mind?
I'm going to piggyback on my first set of points, and that is not being thoughtful enough about your interview questions. So not getting caught up in, let's just use a template for that role that we can find online. Really aligning those questions to what your organization's about, what that role is going to require of that individual. And even allowing for you to maybe delve in deeper based on what the response is. So taking advantage of that time with the candidate to be able to really suss out as much information as possible. So when you're done with that interview, you feel confident one way or the other that whatever decision you make going forward is in alignment to what you're trying to accomplish and what you heard from the information received.
Really good. I'm going to sort of summarize that by tailoring the interview, if you will, to your organization, your organization's mission, culture, etc., and not kind of taking the easy route or the generic route. I think that's really good. Jason, I wanted to ask you about budgeting errors as it relates to hiring, since we're kind of talking about hiring in general, but we're also talking about hiring as it relates to scaling. And an important component of that is being able to scale and still afford the employees that you're putting in place. How have you all seen sort of across your client portfolio, not necessarily specific to scholarship prep, but how have you seen that take place? Is that a potential pitfall that you all are seeing where maybe things are not factored in correctly and that impacts hiring?
Yeah, so definitely not a pitfall with scholarship prep. They do a great job of their budgeting as we have those conversations. We had our first conversation this week, so perfect timing as we kick off budgeting season. But you definitely see some schools where they will see their budget, and instead of assessing their proper enrollment and where they think their attendance is going to come in, they see that they're at a deficit and they go, we'll add 10 kids, we're going to get them. And so they fill these holes in their budget by adding more kids that are not realistic to what they actually think they can obtain. So that way they can present a balanced budget to start the year. But along those lines, I think educators that start schools, they are passionate about what they're doing. And you, in a lot of ways, need to treat this as a business. If you don't run a surplus, even as a nonprofit, year over year, you're not going to be in a sustainable position to keep the school running, and the entire mission isn't going to last. Scholarship Prep does a great job. We get the enrollment and information on staffing, we put it into the models, and we see where the chips fall, and then we make adjustments from there. But the adjustments are never with their enrollment because they know what they anticipate for the enrollment. It's the staffing levels, it's other areas. Similarly, Scholarship Prep in recent years, not on the jobs front, but they've been moving into facilities, their own facilities. So we've had lots of conversations about what is affordable in their budget instead of finding a place, entering into it, and then figuring out how we balance the budget thereafter, being proactive on the budget to see what is workable, both on the position side and on the rent side is like probably the two biggest costs school incur.
So I guess I would call that the living in reality, the living in reality pitfall of let's not imagine a higher revenue stream, but let's live in the situation that we're in today. I think that's really good.
Yeah, I think school leaders are optimistic people, and it's great. It's refreshing and nice, but there has to be some reality to the optimism as well.
All right, well, let's get into a couple positive recommendations. So I know we've talked about some pitfalls to watch out for, and I wanted to talk through a couple different things that came up actually as we were having a conversation prior to this interview. And these were some things that Jason Watts, you had come up with. And so I want to go through each of these kind of one by one, just quickly, and have you sort of explain your experience as it relates to each of these recommendations. And then we'll wrap up here in a bit. So I'll go through these one by one, and feel free to take these in whatever direction you want. But the first recommendation that you had was being comfortable growing into the unknown. Basically, as you're scaling, as you're adding people to your team, getting comfortable with the fact that hiring might look a little bit different as you move into unknown places and unknown communities. And so could you share a little bit about your experience, especially like you mentioned this earlier, your second school was 45 minutes away from your first school. And as you all have gone LA versus Orange County versus San Diego, what have been some of those learnings moving into kind of unknown spaces with the organization?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that some we could predict and some we didn't, and that we had to deal with later on. So when you're looking at, say, the comparison between Oceanside and San Diego County versus our school that's in the LAUSD region, there's a difference in cost of living. We have one pay scale for the entire organization. And so what may be, hey, this is a really good salary that competes really well with the local district schools versus, say, in LA, and we are under the average district salary per position. That could be problematic. So that's something to consider. I would say some of our sites are not in close proximity to where employees are coming from. So they may be, in some cases, able to live 5 minutes from the school. Other cases, they're driving 45 minutes to the school. Well, that makes it more difficult to keep those people, right? Because if they find something closer to where they live, comparable salary, they may take it. And I would say that another one is the ability to support those multiple sites being so remote from one to the other. So we have to ensure that we are able to have boots on the ground, and still to this day do, with all of these new sites that come online from a training perspective, programmatic implementation perspective, and then commit to that. So if we're opening this site that's, say, 45 minutes from one location or 30 minutes from another location or even out of state, if you don't have the capacity to have boots on the ground, then the likelihood of your program being able to be replicated in a positive way is that much more difficult. You can talk to people until you're blue in the face on a Zoom, but if you don't see it in person, you don't see what's happening in classrooms, you don't see what's happening when it comes to parents walking into the front office and the relationship or interactions you see between office staff and families. It's hard for you to make adjustments, and some of those adjustments are critical to being successful, whether it's short-term or long-term. So I think those three things are some of which we were able to predict and some of which we had to adapt on the fly based on seeing how impactful they really were to our endeavors.
Right. I think those are super helpful recommendations, just as you reflect on that experience. In terms of moving us on to our second learning here, the second thing you had was operating like an owner, or thinking like a private CEO almost. And Jason Sitomer actually alluded to this, kind of that idea of there's no margin, there's no mission, basically. Your organization can't operate in perpetuity. How do you think about that personally? Like, how do you think about operating as a quote unquote owner or CEO?
Look, my start in my career was as a teacher. Then I became a site administrator. Now I'm in this role that I'm in, overseeing an entire organization. So over time, I've had to convert my thinking from being that teacher in a single classroom and having that particular relationship with my students to, I am running a multi-million-dollar business. There are hundreds of employees who rely upon me to make sound decisions every single day. And if I don't, it impacts many, many people. So whether we like it or not, we are business owners. We are business people. And so we have to include that as part of our mindset, whether it's as you're developing your organization or as you're growing. So as an example, as we are preparing to create a salary structure and different incentives for employees, I looked at the Forbes 100 top companies to work for and took pointers from the things that different successful organizations have done previously to see how we can implement that in our organization. So we came up with a 403B matching program that at the time I didn't hear of any other charter schools that were implementing. And then that's one. Another example from a more longitudinal and impactful perspective is our mission and vision is clear. We knew who we wanted to serve, underserved communities. As hard as those communities are to serve and serve well, we also knew that based on that demographic, it would generate more funding for us to be able to serve them. So we're accessing different funding streams like SB 740, which allows us to have rental reimbursement costs every single year. And those funds are critical for our survival. Those funds were critical for us to be able to grow from a 250 school site year one to a second school site year two, because we were generating a lot of funds, even for there's only 250 students per student, and our rent costs were low. So we didn't say, we're going to build our first school from the ground up. I don't even know how someone could do that. That's crazy. So we had to have the mindset of we were ready to rent for perpetuity if necessary. And that's been it's been a boon to us because those Orange County schools were able to develop a strong reserve over time to position us to do things like build our first school from the ground up a couple of years ago. So that all came from the genesis of having the business-minded thought process, both from a short and long-term perspective.
Jason, do you find that, and this is again, not speaking to any specific client, but do you observe across the schools that you all have worked with kind of that mindset difference that Jason's alluding to of maybe leaders who have come up through the academic hierarchy, so to speak? And then how do you all as Charter Impact think about kind of helping them bridge the gap to thinking, as Jason described, like they're running a multi-million-dollar organization?
Yeah, similar to Jason, I think most of the school leaders we work with were originally teachers. I think that's sort of how you get your foot in the door here, and then you figure out that, hey, I could probably do this better myself, right? Charter Impact's clients are really diverse and spread out. I think our smallest school is 45 students, all the way to 6 network with 8,000 students. So we really run the gamut of people who have the mindset of a business owner versus an educator. Sometimes it's much easier to have those conversations with the multi-school network. They've shown success, whereas some of the smaller schools, they find a way to make it work, hopefully. We also, last year, had 2 schools close. The pandemic hit a lot of schools hard, and dwindling enrollment is happening. So it's having those hard conversations, again, because it's from a place of partnership, not we're a vendor, we don't care, we'll watch this thing burn. That's not our goal. It's, hey, this model isn't sustainable. How can we help you get it to a place of sustainability? And if we can't, how can we successfully shut it down in a way that's not going to displace kids? One great example, I think we have a school with about 65 kids. There's no person on the staff, including the executive director, who makes more than the salary exempt minimum in California. That speaks to like their passion, that they're not taking like a leadership sort of salary because they're so passionate about this school and they are happy with having 65 kids. But if that person was making, probably like a similar compensation for being an executive director of a school, the model wouldn't work. And so sacrifice happens when you're not looking at this like economies of scale in order to make it work.
All right, so I want to take us to 1 or 2 final learnings or recommendations. We already talked about, I'll just name this one again and we'll move past it, but we already talked a lot about kind of this idea of expertise versus compatibility and the benefits of having long-term experts in your organization. Kind of related to this, one of the other learnings or recommendations you had listed here, Jason, was taking a unique approach for each position and each location. We hit on this a little bit at the top of the conversation. Could you share maybe why this has become so important to you? And then maybe if you have any examples that come to mind, specific or general, of roles that you had to fill, or maybe roles that you're currently thinking about filling, and how you're thinking about how the location and the specific role impacts the type of person you're hoping to bring into the organization.
Yeah, so again, with our 4 sites, they're all very different. We have the same program being implemented essentially at every one of the sites, but the way that it's being implemented has to change with the demographics, the locale, et cetera. So it's really about having your finger on the pulse of that particular school community and knowing what they need. And there's been situations where we've created positions that really were designed for that particular school site that we may or may not be able to replicate somewhere else just because of need. As an example, we created a dean of mathematics at one of our sites because they were having some challenge with math outcomes. So rather than hiring, say, a math teacher that would work with a defined group of kids, we hired someone who could help the entire staff that would work with students on mathematics grades TK through 8 to have a more global impact. Our other sites didn't need that at the time. I think not being afraid to fill the gaps that you have, but you have to know what those gaps are first. So there's a whole other conversation we can have about the diagnoses of how you would do that. But it goes back to what I said earlier, right? Boots in the ground. If I am the founder, as I am, and I have this educational expertise coming into this role, and I'm not either myself boots in the ground to make sure that our program is being implemented with fidelity, then there better be somebody else on my team who could do that. And if we have that in place and we are holding folks accountable, including ourselves, it makes it easier for us to diagnose the issues and then create action plans around how to move past those challenges. And so that unique approach is create what needs to be created. Know why you need to create it in advance, then have follow through to make sure that that was the right decision. If not, pivot again. And that's the great thing about charter schools, really, our capacity to pivot. And I hope all of us are taking advantage of that opportunity because we really don't have a lot of governors on the ability to pivot and the need to pivot. Whereas maybe a district system that has more definition around their kind of rules or regulations, so to speak, is potentially handcuffing some of that movement on the spot.
All right, so let me use this emphasis or the ability to pivot and be flexible to ask a final question here, and then we can wrap up. As you all think about the current state, this is kind of a question for both of you. As you're continuing to hire people, bring people into your organization using some of the principles we just talked about, as you continue to grow the organization, how do you all in your partnership, Jason thinking about kind of the finance side, you, Jason, thinking about where the organization is at academically, the mission, where you're leading people. Where are you guys at right now in terms of growth? And specifically, how do you plan for adding that additional campus? You talked about going from 1 to 4. When you're thinking about adding 5, what are some of the conversations you're having right now, specifically as it relates to like budgeting and hiring and how you're going to staff up that new location? I think that would be interesting for the audience to hear how you think about that now that you've done it 4 times. What are maybe some of the things that you need to do to prep for that additional growth step?
This is a great question, and there's a lot of ways to go with it. I'll start because I think the other Jason can piggyback off of this. So we're looking at from the outset alignment with our mission and vision, right? So demographics, academic outcomes in the community. And so part of the preparation for staffing, overall budgetary alignment is based on where you're going to be going. So facility costs are top of the kind of mind conversations. How readily available are they? Do you have to buy? Do you have to rent? And those two directions are so different, they dramatically impact your capacity to implement your program. And so that's where it's really vital to have the triangulation between your mission and vision, the needs of that community, and then the different cost perspectives of what it's going to take to locate there. I mean, there's all different kinds of conversations that are on the periphery of those 3 topics, but as we're building that kind of capacity in our mind for that site, that's where we're talking to Jason at Charter Impact and his team on, hey, do they have any schools that they already serve or work with in those regions that we can talk to talk about some of the pressure points and landmines? What are the types of staffing needs we're looking at? If we go into a facility that only has 250 student capacity, is that sustainable? If the only option is to buy and it's going to cost us X amount, how does that prohibit our programmatic implementation? So there's a lot of ways to go that can derail that growth possibility. And I think that's one of the most difficult things for me in my seat is you get excited about going to a region. You get excited about serving a particular community. And then these come up and they're like, nope, stop, full stop. And not that Jason and his team tell us full stop, but they're kind of telling us what we may already know and don't want to hear, in some cases. And that's really vital to have a partner that can do that with you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of a silly personal analogy, but I remember my wife and I moved kind of in the middle of the pandemic and the housing market was really crazy all over the place. And we kept getting outbid on houses. And it was like every time you go into a neighborhood or a community, you start envisioning your life there. And you're like, these are going to be my neighbors. And this is, where we're going to do our grocery shopping. And these are our people. And then all of a sudden it's like, nope, back to the drawing board. So that's my random personal analogy. I don't know if it necessarily applies, but that's exactly what I was thinking of when you were talking about you start to get excited. Jason, what about the finance side of things? Where piggyback on what the other Jason was saying, how do you all think about partnering with your clients through these types of growth endeavors?
I think probably the biggest thing is out-of-state expansion with our clients and potential new clients. So in total, Charter Impact has just a little under 100 schools that we support. 90% of that is in California. We have 4 schools that we're supporting in Arizona. I have a director that lives in Scottsdale and supports those schools. We support 4 schools in Nevada. I have a director that lives in Vegas supporting those schools. It is very niche. Each state is so unique in their funding model, in their cash flow timing, in all of those elements. It's not a one-for-one. So we've found that when we have a client that is expanding into a new state, or we get a new client like Arizona, we got a 3-school network as a new client, we hire a director in that state that has that expertise already. Because again, we're being hired as the industry experts. We can't learn it on the job. We want to come in with that knowledge and expertise, and we only get one first impression in that state, right? So we don't want to falter. It's that CFO level knowledge that's so key. Accounting is accounting. We can do debits and credits and run the GL according to the state. It's knowing the compliance calendar and what the state reporting looks like and how grants can be spent and all these very specific things. And so that has been our model, is make sure we have the in-house expertise as we expand into a new state with our vision here to continue to grow. We've been on a trajectory of about 25% growth year over year for the last 2 years. And so that would be like another 25 schools in the next year, which probably is too large, but maybe 25% growth in students, because we've really been obtaining large schools, as you see. Digressing a little bit, but another example, I talked about like continuity. And so there's definitely been turnover at schools. Taking a step back, episode 6, you had Kennedy from ACE on the show. ACE and Kennedy are also one of Charter Impact's clients. There's a situation where like the CFO left and they didn't want to have to find someone who already had all this knowledge, and they didn't want the possibility of another CFO leaving. And so that continuity that we bring, along with our expertise and knowledge and advice and thought partnership, that's really what differentiates us and why the financial back office model is so prevalent.
Well, guys, I really appreciate your time and expertise today. Jason, where should people go if they want to learn more about scholarship prep? Maybe someone's listening and they think, hey, I'm interested in this organization. Maybe there's a job opening, or they're curious to hear more about your own story. Where should we send listeners?
Yeah, so our website is scholarshipschools.org, and they're welcome to email me as well. My email, and I apologize, it's not short, but it's J Watts, WATTS, at scholarshipschools.org.
Well, we'll link to both of those in the show notes. And Jason, where should people go if they want to learn about Charter Impact?
So similar, our website is charterimpact.com. You can go there. There's a contact us link, submit a form, or always welcome to email me directly. It is jsitomer, Sitomer, at charterimpact.com.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.